My name is David, and I'm 68 years old. What I'm about to share with you will probably shock many people, but it's a story that needs to be told. It's about my father, Elder Thomas Mitchell, who spent 43 years as one of the most respected leaders in our Jehovah's Witness congregation in Cedar Valley. It's about the secrets he carried, the lies he helped perpetuate, and the devastating confession he made to me just hours before he died. This isn't just my story, it's the story of thousands of families who've been torn apart by an organization that claims to speak for God while protecting predators and punishing those who dare to speak the truth. I grew up in what most people would consider a picture-perfect religious household. My father was appointed as an elder when I was just 12 years old back in 1967. Our house on Maple Street was always spotless, always ready for unexpected visits from traveling overseers or circuit supervisors. My mother, Sarah, was the model of submissive Christian womanhood, always in service to the organization, always supporting my father's decisions without question, always making sure our family looked exemplary to the outside world. We attended every meeting, participated in field service every Saturday morning, and hosted the book study in our living room every Tuesday evening. My father was a tall, imposing man with steel-grey hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. When he spoke from the platform during meetings, the entire congregation would fall silent. His voice carried authority, and his knowledge of Watchtower publications was encyclopedic. He could quote any scripture from memory and explain complex prophetic timelines that left even other elders nodding in admiration. Brother Mitchell, as everyone called him, was the man families turned to when they had problems. He conducted judicial committees, gave counsel to struggling marriages, and was often called upon to handle the most sensitive matters within our congregation of nearly 200 publishers. Growing up as an elder's son came with tremendous pressure and equally tremendous privilege. Other children in the congregation looked up to me, but they also watched my every move, ready to report any transgression to their parents. I couldn't afford to make mistakes that other kids might get away with. At the same time, I had access to conversations and information that most congregation members never heard. I would sit quietly in the corner during elder meetings in our home, pretending to study while actually listening to discussions about disfellowshipping cases, congregation finances, and directives from the society's headquarters in Brooklyn. What struck me most as a child was how different my father seemed during these private meetings compared to his public persona. On the platform, he was warm, encouraging, full of hope about the coming new system. But behind closed doors, I heard a different tone. Cold, calculating, sometimes even cruel when discussing members who had stepped out of line. I remember overhearing him tell another elder that a young sister who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock needed to be made an example of, even though she was genuinely repentant and came from a broken home. "The congregation needs to see that actions have consequences," he said in a voice I barely recognized as belonging to my loving father. As I entered my teenage years in the early 1970s, I began to notice inconsistencies that troubled me deeply. The organization constantly preached about 1975 being the end of this system of things, and many families in our congregation sold their homes, quit their jobs, and pioneered full-time in preparation for Armageddon. My father encouraged these decisions from the platform, citing Watchtower articles and assembly talks that seemed to guarantee the end would come before I even graduated high school. But privately, I heard him advising my mother to keep her part-time job at the local bank and not to make any drastic financial decisions. "We need to be practical," he told her one evening when he thought I wasn't listening. "The society's timeline might need adjustment." The hypocrisy became more apparent as I grew older. My father would give stern talks about the dangers of higher education, warning young people that college would destroy their faith and distract them from kingdom interests. Yet when I expressed interest in becoming a mechanic after high school, he quietly encouraged me to take business courses at the community college. "You need practical skills," he explained, "but don't tell anyone I said that." And this double standard extended to many areas of our life. We were supposed to avoid worldly associations, yet my father maintained friendships with several non-witness business contacts. We were taught to trust completely in Jehovah's provision, yet our family always seemed to have more financial security than most other witnesses I knew. The breaking point for me came when I was 19 years old. A young girl in our congregation, barely 14, came forward with accusations against one of the ministerial servants. She claimed he had been inappropriately touching her during field service when they were paired together for territory work. The matter was handled in typical Watchtower fashion. A judicial committee was formed, consisting of my father and 2 other elders. I only learned the details years later, but the girl was questioned extensively about her conduct, her clothing, whether she had somehow encouraged the behavior. The ministerial servant, a man in his 40s with a wife and children, denied everything. According to Watchtower policy, there needed to be 2 witnesses to any wrongdoing for judicial action to be taken. Since there was only the girl's testimony, the matter was dropped. The ministerial servant kept his position, and the girl's family was counseled about the serious nature of false accusations. Within 6 months, the family had moved to another state. I never saw them again, but I'll never forget the look in that young girl's eyes during the few meetings she attended before they left. A look of betrayal and abandonment that haunted me for decades. It was around this time that I began to seriously question everything I had been taught. I started reading the Bible without Watchtower publications, and I was amazed at how different the message seemed when it wasn't filtered through organizational interpretation. Jesus spoke about love, forgiveness, and direct access to God. Paul wrote about freedom in Christ and the dangers of adding human traditions to God's requirements. But the organization I grew up in seemed to contradict these principles at every turn. Instead of freedom, there was control. Instead of love, there was conditional acceptance based on meeting attendance and field service hours. Instead of direct access to God, there was a complex hierarchy of men who claimed to be God's sole channel of communication. When I tried to discuss these concerns with my father, his response was always the same. "You need to trust the faithful and discreet slave class. They have been appointed by God to provide spiritual food at the proper time. Your job is not to question, but to obey." But I could see something in his eyes during these conversations. A flicker of doubt, a moment of uncertainty that he quickly suppressed. It was as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. By my early 20s, I had made the difficult decision to fade away from the organization gradually. I stopped commenting at meetings, reduced my field service participation, and eventually stopped attending altogether. My parents were devastated, but they didn't shun me completely since I had never been baptized. However, our relationship became strained and distant. Family gatherings were uncomfortable affairs filled with pointed comments about my spiritual condition and subtle attempts to guilt me back into the organization. I built a life outside the witness community, something that seemed almost impossible after being so completely immersed in it for my first 2 decades. I met my wife Rebecca at the community college where I was studying business management. She had grown up Methodist but wasn't particularly religious, and she listened with amazement as I told her about my upbringing. We married in a small civil ceremony. My parents attended but made it clear they disapproved of my choice to marry outside the truth. We had 2 children, Michael and Jennifer, who grew up knowing their grandfather was a Jehovah's Witness, but never fully understanding what that meant for our family dynamics. The years passed, and my relationship with my father remained cordial, but distant. He would call occasionally to check on us, and we would visit for major holidays, though these visits were always tense. He couldn't help but preach, and I couldn't help but challenge his beliefs. My mother served as a buffer between us, trying to maintain family peace while struggling with her own divided loyalties. She loved her son and grandchildren, but she also feared that associating too closely with us might affect her standing in the congregation. As my father aged, I noticed changes in him that went beyond the normal effects of getting older. He seemed increasingly troubled, often staring off into space during our visits. He would start to say something, then stop himself, as if catching himself before revealing something he shouldn't. My mother mentioned that he had been having trouble sleeping and seemed preoccupied with events from the past. "He keeps talking about things he should have done differently," she told me during one of our private conversations. "But when I ask him what he means, he just says, 'I wouldn't understand.'" The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. My father had collapsed during the morning meeting and was rushed to Memorial Hospital. The doctors said it was a massive heart attack, and while they had managed to stabilize him, his condition was critical. I drove to the hospital immediately, my mind racing with all the unresolved issues between us. When I arrived, I found my mother sitting beside his bed, holding his hand and whispering prayers. He was conscious but weak, his usually commanding presence reduced to that of a frail old man connected to machines and monitors. "David," he whispered when he saw me enter the room, "I'm glad you came. There are things I need to tell you before it's too late." The urgency in his voice surprised me. This wasn't the formal, controlled tone I had grown accustomed to during our adult relationship. This was the voice of a man who knew his time was running out and had something weighing heavily on his conscience. Over the next 3 days, my father drifted in and out of consciousness. But during his lucid moments, he began to reveal things that shattered everything I thought I knew about his life as an elder. The first confession came on Wednesday evening when the nurses had dimmed the lights and my mother had gone home to rest. I was sitting beside his bed, reading a magazine, when I heard his voice barely above a whisper. "David, do you remember the Carpenter family?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I did remember them. Brother and Sister Carpenter and their 3 children had been active members of our congregation throughout my teenage years. They had moved away suddenly when I was about 20, and I had always wondered why they left so abruptly. "They didn't move by choice," my father continued, his voice growing stronger with what seemed like determination. "We forced them out. The circuit overseer gave us direct orders to make their lives so uncomfortable that they would have no choice but to leave. The reason, according to my father, was that Brother Carpenter had asked too many questions during a Watchtower study. He had questioned the society's interpretation of certain prophecies and had privately expressed doubts about some of the organization's practices. Rather than address his concerns or attempt to help him understand, the body of elders received instructions to systematically isolate the family. They were removed from parts on the theocratic ministry school, excluded from social gatherings, and subjected to constant surveillance and criticism. "We made them feel like outcasts in their own congregation," my father admitted, tears forming in his eyes, "all because a good man asked legitimate questions that we were too afraid to answer honestly." This revelation was just the beginning. Over the following days, my father unburdened himself of decades of secrets and regrets. He told me about judicial committees where the outcome was decided before the accused even entered the room. He described cases where young people were disfellowshipped for minor infractions, while elders' children who committed similar or worse offenses received private counsel and second chances. The justice system I had grown up believing was guided by divine wisdom was actually influenced by favoritism, politics, and the social standing of those involved. The worst part, he confessed on Thursday morning, was the children. "We destroyed so many young lives because we were more concerned about the organization's reputation than protecting innocent kids." He went on to describe multiple cases of child abuse that had been reported to the elders but never to the authorities. The standard protocol was to handle everything internally, following the biblical requirement for 2 witnesses that made conviction nearly impossible in cases of abuse, which typically occurred in private. Perpetrators were counseled, sometimes moved to other congregations, but rarely faced real consequences for their actions. One case in particular seemed to haunt my father more than the others. A 10-year-old girl named Amanda Morrison had told her parents that her grandfather, a respected elder in a neighboring congregation, had been molesting her during family visits. When the matter was brought to the circuit overseer, my father was part of a committee formed to investigate. "We questioned that little girl for hours," he said, his voice breaking. "We asked her details that no child should have to describe. We made her repeat her story over and over, looking for inconsistencies, and when her grandfather denied everything, we told the family that without additional witnesses, we couldn't take action. The Morrison family was counseled about the serious nature of false accusations and warned about the consequences of spreading slanderous talk within the congregation. Amanda's grandfather continued in his position as an elder, while Amanda herself began showing signs of severe emotional distress. The family eventually stopped attending meetings regularly, and within 2 years, they had faded away completely. "That little girl tried to tell us the truth," my father whispered, "and we called her a liar. I knew she was telling the truth, David. I could see it in her eyes. But we were more worried about a scandal than protecting a child." As my father continued his confessions, I began to understand the psychological prison he had lived in for decades. The organization demanded absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience from its elders, while simultaneously loading them with responsibility for decisions that often contradicted their basic human decency. They were expected to enforce policies they privately disagreed with, punish people they personally cared about, and maintain silence about injustices they witnessed firsthand. The weight of these contradictions had been eating away at my father's soul for years, but the fear of losing everything he had built his life around kept him trapped in complicity. "I tried to quit being an elder 3 different times," he revealed during one of our conversations, "but each time they convinced me to stay. They said the congregation needed me, that Jehovah was using me, that stepping down would cause stumbling. What they really meant was that I knew too much to be allowed to walk away quietly." He described the subtle but unmistakable threats that accompanied any elder who expressed doubts or tried to reduce his involvement. Families were warned about associating with former elders who had stepped down under questionable circumstances. Business relationships were severed, social connections were cut, and a network of informal surveillance ensured that any potential troublemaker was closely monitored. The financial aspects of the organization's control were particularly eye-opening. My father revealed that congregation funds were routinely sent to the society under various pretexts, leaving local congregations struggling to maintain their kingdom halls, while the organization accumulated massive wealth. Elders were pressured to encourage generous donations during circuit overseer visits. Assembly expenses were inflated beyond actual costs, and families were guilt-tripped into contributing money they could barely afford. "We took money from people who needed it to feed their children," my father said with disgust, "and we convinced them it was a sacred privilege to give until it hurt." The most devastating revelation came on Friday afternoon, when my father asked my mother to leave the room so he could speak with me privately. What he told me next explained why he had seemed so troubled in recent years and why this deathbed confession felt so urgent to him. 6 months earlier, he'd been approached by a private investigator who was working on a case involving historical child abuse within Jehovah's Witness congregations. The investigator had somehow obtained my father's name as someone who might have information about specific incidents that had occurred in our circuit during the 1980s and 1990s. "He knew things, David," my father said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "He had documents, names, dates. He knew about Amanda Morrison and at least 6 other children whose cases we had covered up. He offered me immunity if I would testify about what really happened in those judicial committees. The investigator had given my father time to consider, but the deadline for cooperation was approaching quickly. I've been living in terror for months, knowing that the truth is finally catching up with us. Part of me wants to testify, to finally do the right thing for those children, but I'm 76 years old, David. If I expose the organization, I lose everything. Your mother's support, my entire social network, my identity. I don't know if I have the courage to start over at my age. The internal struggle my father was experiencing became clear as he continued talking. He was caught between his desire to finally tell the truth and his fear of the consequences that truth would bring. The organization had been his entire life for over 5 decades. Every friendship, every social connection, every aspect of his identity was tied to his position as a respected elder. Walking away would mean losing not just his status, but his entire support system at the most vulnerable time of his life. Yet the weight of his complicity in covering up child abuse was slowly destroying what remained of his peace of mind. This conversation helped me understand why my father had been so conflicted during my own questioning years earlier. Part of him recognized the validity of my concerns, but admitting that would have required acknowledging that he had wasted his entire adult life serving an organization that was fundamentally corrupt. The cognitive dissonance was too painful to face directly, so he had chosen to suppress his doubts and continue playing his role as a faithful elder, while privately struggling with the contradictions he couldn't ignore. Before I continue with the rest of my father's story, I want to pause and speak directly to those of you who might be watching this video. If you've made it this far, you're probably feeling a range of emotions: shock, anger, sadness, maybe even recognition if you've experienced something similar in your own religious community. I know this isn't easy to hear, but I believe these stories need to be told. Too many families have been destroyed by religious organizations that prioritize their reputation over the welfare of their members, especially the most vulnerable among them. I'm sharing my father's story not to attack anyone's faith or to discourage people from seeking spiritual community, but to shine light on the dangers of giving any human organization unchecked authority over your life and conscience. If this resonates with you, if you have your own story of religious abuse or manipulation, please know that you're not alone. There are resources available, people who understand what you've been through and hope for healing and recovery. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you experienced similar situations in your own religious community? Do you have questions about how to help someone who might be trapped in a controlling religious environment? Your engagement and support mean everything to me as I continue to share these difficult but necessary truths. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel, not just for the algorithm, but because every subscription represents another person who believes these stories matter, another voice supporting survivors, another step toward preventing future abuse. The envelope my father gave me on Saturday morning contained 47 pages of documentation that would forever change my understanding of the organization I had grown up in. With trembling hands, he reached into the drawer of his hospital bedside table and pulled out a manila envelope that had clearly been handled many times. The edges were worn, and I could see that it had been opened and resealed repeatedly, as if my father had been wrestling with the decision of what to do with its contents for months. "I've been carrying this burden for too long," he whispered as he handed it to me. Inside that envelope are copies of letters from the society, judicial committee notes I kept over the years, and documentation of cases that were never properly handled. I made copies of everything because something inside me knew that someday someone would need to see the truth. His hand shook as he released the envelope into my care. "I don't have the strength to do what needs to be done with this information, but maybe you do. The first document I examined later that evening, in the privacy of my hotel room, was a letter dated March 15, 1983, from the Society's Service Department to all circuit overseers. The letter outlined specific procedures for handling allegations of child abuse within congregations, and what I read made my stomach turn. The primary concern expressed throughout the letter was not the protection of children, but the protection of the organization's reputation. Circuit overseers were instructed to contact the Society's legal department immediately upon learning of any abuse allegations, but they were specifically warned against encouraging families to contact law enforcement unless required by state law. The letter contained phrases that revealed the organization's true priorities with shocking clarity. While we certainly want to protect children from harm, one paragraph read, we must also be mindful of the potential damage that false or unsubstantiated allegations can cause to the reputation of God's organization and to individual elders who may be falsely accused. And the document went on to outline strategies for discouraging victims and their families from pursuing legal action, including reminders about the biblical principle of not taking fellow believers to court and warnings about the spiritual dangers of involving secular authorities in congregation matters. What struck me most about this letter was how it systematically dismantled any meaningful accountability for perpetrators while placing enormous pressure on victims to remain silent. The two-witness rule was emphasized repeatedly as an absolute requirement for any congregational action, despite the obvious impossibility of finding witnesses to abuse that typically occurred in private. Even more disturbing was a section that advised elders to question child victims extensively about their own conduct, their clothing choices, and whether they might have somehow encouraged inappropriate behavior from adults. Another document in the envelope was a handwritten list in my father's careful script, titled Cases Requiring Follow-Up. It contained the names of 17 individuals who had been accused of various forms of abuse or misconduct over the years, along with brief notations about how each case was handled. Next to each name, my father had written the outcome: transferred to Riverside Congregation, privately reproved, no action, insufficient evidence, moved to different circuit. Not a single entry mentioned police involvement or any real consequences for the accused perpetrators. I recognized several names on the list, including Brother Kenneth Walsh, who had served as a ministerial servant in our congregation throughout my teenage years. According to my father's notes, Brother Walsh had been accused by 3 different families of inappropriate contact with their children during congregation social gatherings. The cases were reported between 1985 and 1987, but each time, the two-witness rule prevented any formal action. Instead of removing Brother Walsh from his position or restricting his access to children, the elders simply counseled the families about the importance of proper supervision and warned them against spreading unsubstantiated rumors. Brother Walsh continued serving as a ministerial servant for another 8 years before finally being transferred to a congregation in another state when persistent whispers about his behavior made his continued presence problematic. My father's notes indicated that the receiving congregation was never informed about the previous allegations. We were told that sharing such information would constitute slander since the allegations were never proven, my father had written in the margin. Brother Walsh was given a fresh start, while the families he had harmed were left to deal with the trauma alone. The most detailed documentation in the envelope concerned the case of Amanda Morrison, the 10-year-old girl my father had mentioned during our hospital conversations. The file contained transcripts of her judicial committee hearings, and reading them was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. The committee, which included my father, had subjected this child to 3 separate interrogation sessions, each lasting several hours. The transcripts revealed the inappropriate and traumatizing nature of the questioning she endured. In the first session, Amanda was asked to describe in explicit detail what her grandfather had done to her. When she became upset and had difficulty continuing, the committee chairman told her that if she was making false accusations, she would be responsible before God for the harm she was causing to an innocent elder. She was asked why she had not screamed for help, why she had not immediately told her parents, and whether she had done anything to encourage her grandfather's behavior. The questions became increasingly aggressive as the session continued, with elders suggesting that perhaps she had misunderstood innocent gestures of affection. The second session took place a week later, after Amanda's grandfather had categorically denied all allegations. This time, the committee focused on perceived inconsistencies in Amanda's account, pointing out minor differences in how she described the timing and sequence of events. They questioned her about her emotional state, suggesting that perhaps stress from her parents' recent divorce had caused her to imagine things that had not actually happened. When Amanda became distressed and began crying, she was told that her emotional response proved she was not mature enough to understand the seriousness of making false accusations against a servant of Jehovah. The final session occurred 2 weeks later, and by this time, Amanda had clearly been coached by adults who were more concerned about protecting the organization than protecting her. Her responses had become wooden and rehearsed, and when asked directly if she was certain about her allegations, she whispered that perhaps she had been confused about what had happened. The committee seized on this uncertainty as vindication of their approach, and they concluded their report by stating that the accusations appeared to be the result of a troubled child's imagination rather than actual abuse. My father's personal notes in the margin of these transcripts revealed his internal struggle during this process. "This child is telling the truth," he had written next to Amanda's initial testimony. "Her grandfather's denials lack conviction." But later notes showed how the committee's predetermined conclusion had influenced his thinking. "Committee unanimous that allegations lack substance," he had written after the final session. Child appeared confused and unable to maintain consistent account. However, a note added in different ink and clearly written years later read, "I was wrong. I failed this child. May God forgive me." The envelope also contained correspondence between my father and other elders expressing private doubts about various organizational policies and procedures. One letter from Elder Richard Hartwell of the Pine Valley congregation described his concerns about the society's handling of abuse allegations. "I have served as an elder for 23 years, Brother Hartwell had written, and I can no longer reconcile what we are asked to do with what my conscience tells me is right. We are protecting predators while abandoning victims, and we are doing it in God's name." Another letter, this one from Elder Marcus Thompson, described the psychological toll of enforcing policies he privately disagreed with. "I find myself lying awake at night, thinking about the families we have destroyed through our rigid application of disfellowshipping procedures," he wrote. "Yesterday, I had to announce the expulsion of a 17-year-old girl whose only crime was accepting a blood transfusion that saved her life after a car accident. Her parents are devastated, her younger siblings are traumatized, and our congregation has lost one of its most promising young members. How is this serving God's interests?" These letters revealed a network of elders who privately questioned the organization's policies, but felt trapped by the system they had devoted their lives to serving. They shared their doubts and concerns with trusted colleagues, but none of them had the courage to speak out publicly or to challenge the organization's authority directly. The fear of losing their positions, their social networks, and their sense of identity kept them compliant even when their consciences rebelled against what they were being asked to do. Perhaps the most damning document in the envelope was a memo from the Society's legal department dated September 8, 1994, addressed to all circuit overseers and marked confidential, not for distribution. The memo outlined strategies for dealing with what it termed disgruntled former members who might attempt to expose organizational secrets or pursue legal action against the society. The document contained explicit instructions for elders to gather potentially damaging information about anyone who might pose a threat to the organization's reputation. Former members who persist in making allegations against the organization or its representatives should be carefully monitored, the memo stated. Elders should discreetly gather information about such individuals' personal lives, including any moral failings, financial difficulties, or emotional instabilities that might be used to discredit their testimony should legal proceedings arise. The memo went on to provide specific examples of how such information could be used to undermine the credibility of accusers in court proceedings or media interviews. The document also contained guidelines for pressuring active members who might be considering speaking out about organizational problems. Members who express doubts or ask persistent questions about organizational policies should be subjected to increased shepherding visits and spiritual counseling, it advised. Their associates should be cautioned about the spiritual dangers of listening to negative talk, and their standing in the congregation should be carefully monitored for any signs of apostasy. The memo made it clear that the organization viewed any criticism, regardless of its validity, as a threat to be neutralized rather than a concern to be addressed. As I finished reading through all the documents that night, I felt overwhelmed by the scope of the systematic corruption and abuse they revealed. This was not a case of a few bad individuals making poor decisions. This was an institutional pattern of prioritizing organizational interests over human welfare, of protecting perpetrators while silencing victims, of using spiritual authority to manipulate and control vulnerable people. The organization that had claimed to be God's sole channel of truth on earth was revealed to be a human institution driven by the same self-interest and moral blindness that characterized any corrupt corporation or political entity. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but it also brought clarity to questions that had troubled me for decades. Now I understood why my father had seemed so conflicted during my adolescent questioning. Now I understood why so many good people within the organization appeared to struggle with cognitive dissonance. Now I understood why families like the Carpenters and the Morrisons had simply disappeared from our congregation without explanation. They had not left because they lost faith in God. They had left because they could no longer participate in a system that demanded their silence in the face of injustice. My father died peacefully on Sunday morning at 6:47 a.m., with my mother and me holding his hands as the machines monitoring his vital signs fell silent. His last words to me, spoken in a whisper so faint I had to lean close to hear them, were, "Promise me you'll do what I couldn't. Promise me you'll tell the truth." I squeezed his hand and nodded, though at that moment I had no idea how I would possibly fulfill such a promise. The magnitude of what he was asking seemed impossible. How could one person take on an organization with millions of members worldwide, vast financial resources, and a legal department specifically trained to silence critics and protect institutional interests? The funeral arrangements consumed the next several days, and I found myself navigating the complex dynamics of a Jehovah's Witness memorial service as someone who had been out of the organization for over 4 decades. The funeral talk, delivered by Circuit Overseer Brother William Patterson, painted my father as a faithful servant who had devoted his entire adult life to Jehovah's organization. Brother Patterson spoke glowingly about my father's years of service as an elder, his dedication to shepherding the flock, and his unwavering loyalty to the faithful and discreet slave class. The cognitive dissonance of listening to this sanitized version of my father's life while carrying the burden of his deathbed confessions was almost unbearable. Congregation members approached me throughout the day with stories about how my father had helped them during difficult times, how his counsel had strengthened their faith, how his example had inspired them to greater dedication. Sister Margaret Collins, now in her 80s, tearfully told me how my father had conducted Bible studies with her family when they first learned the truth in 1978. "Brother Mitchell saved our eternal lives," she said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Without his patient teaching, we never would have found our way to Jehovah." Brother Stephen Hayes recounted how my father had helped him through a crisis of faith in the early 1990s when he was struggling with doubts about organizational policies. "Your father reminded me that we don't serve imperfect men. We serve Jehovah," he said. "His wisdom kept me from making the terrible mistake of leaving the truth." These interactions were deeply troubling because they highlighted the complex reality of my father's dual existence. The same man who had helped these sincere people find meaning and purpose in their spiritual lives had also participated in a system that systematically protected child abusers and silenced victims. The elder who had strengthened Brother Hayes' faith in the organization had privately harbored serious doubts about that same organization's policies and practices. The gentle shepherd who had patiently taught the Collins family had also interrogated a 10-year-old girl with aggressive questions that traumatized her for life. How could the same person embody such contradictory roles? How could genuine spiritual love coexist with institutional complicity in abuse? After the funeral service, I retreated to my hotel room and spent hours reading through my father's documents again, trying to process the full implications of what I now possessed. These papers represented more than historical evidence of past wrongdoing. They were a roadmap to ongoing systemic problems within an organization that continued to harm vulnerable people while presenting itself as God's chosen instrument on earth. The private investigator my father had mentioned was still waiting for testimony that could help build cases against perpetrators who had escaped justice for decades. Victims and their families were still struggling with trauma that had been compounded by organizational betrayal and abandonment. The decision to go public with this information would have consequences that extended far beyond my personal comfort or safety. My mother, now 73 years old and facing widowhood after 52 years of marriage, would almost certainly lose her entire support network if I exposed the organization's secrets. She had built her identity around being an elder's wife, and her social connections were entirely within the Jehovah's Witness community. If I revealed what my father had told me, she would likely be viewed as guilty by association and subjected to the same shunning and isolation that awaited any family member of someone labeled as an apostate. My own children, now adults with families of their own, would also face consequences. Although they had never been Jehovah's Witnesses, they maintained cordial relationships with their grandmother and had occasionally attended memorial services and other family gatherings where witness relatives were present. My decision to speak out would likely end those relationships permanently, depriving my grandchildren of connections to an entire branch of their extended family. The financial implications were also significant. My small consulting business had several clients who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and I knew that those relationships would be terminated immediately if I became known as an opponent of the organization. Yet the more I considered the alternatives, the more I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in the same system of institutional protection that had tormented my father's conscience for decades. The documents I possessed contained evidence that could help law enforcement agencies investigate crimes that had been covered up for years. They contained information that could validate the experiences of victims who had been told they were liars or troublemakers for speaking out about abuse. They contained proof that the organization's claims of divine guidance and moral superiority were fundamentally fraudulent. I spent the following week reaching out to some of the people mentioned in my father's documentation, trying to understand the current status of cases that had been buried years or decades earlier. Amanda Morrison, now a woman in her 40s, had struggled with addiction and mental health issues throughout her adult life. When I finally located her through social media and carefully explained who I was and why I was calling, her initial response was silent so long I thought the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You mean someone finally believes what happened to me? You mean I wasn't crazy or lying like they said I was?" Amanda's story since leaving the organization was heartbreaking, but also inspiring in its demonstration of human resilience. She had battled depression, anxiety, and PTSD for years, without understanding that her symptoms were connected to the institutional betrayal she had experienced as a child. The message she had internalized from the judicial committee process was that her word was worthless, that authority figures would always protect each other rather than vulnerable individuals, and that speaking truth would only result in punishment and rejection. These beliefs had affected every relationship and every major decision in her adult life. For 35 years, I've questioned my own memory and my own sanity, Amanda told me during one of our phone conversations. I convinced myself that maybe I really had imagined everything, that maybe I was just a disturbed child looking for attention. But deep down, I always knew what really happened. And I always knew that those men in suits chose to protect my abuser instead of protecting me. She had never sought therapy specifically for religious trauma because she didn't realize that such specialized treatment existed. Like many survivors of institutional abuse, she had blamed herself for her ongoing struggles rather than recognizing them as normal responses to abnormal treatment. Other victims I managed to contact shared similar stories of long-term psychological damage compounded by spiritual betrayal. Brother Kenneth Walsh, the ministerial servant who had been accused by multiple families, had continued his pattern of inappropriate behavior after being transferred to other congregations. At least 2 additional families had reported concerns about his conduct over the years, but each time the same institutional protection mechanisms had prevented any meaningful intervention. Brother Walsh had finally died of natural causes in 2015, having never faced legal consequences for decades of predatory behavior that had been enabled and concealed by organizational policies. The families who had reported Brother Walsh's behavior had all eventually left the organization, but not before enduring years of subtle harassment and social pressure designed to discourage them from pursuing their concerns. Parents were told they were being overprotective and suspicious. Children were questioned about whether they had misunderstood innocent contact or had been coached to make false accusations. The message was clear. Challenging the organization's handling of abuse allegations would result in the accusers being treated as the real problem rather than the accused perpetrators. During this same period, I was contacted by the private investigator my father had mentioned, a former police detective named Robert Chen, who specialized in cases involving institutional cover-ups of sexual abuse. Detective Chen had been working for 3 years on a comprehensive investigation of abuse within Jehovah's Witness congregations across multiple states, and he had been frustrated by the difficulty of finding former elders willing to testify about internal organizational practices. Most retired elders either remained loyal to the organization or were too frightened of the consequences to speak publicly about what they had witnessed. Your father's documentation is exactly what we need to demonstrate the systematic nature of the cover-up, Detective Chen explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Springfield. We have individual cases and isolated incidents, but what we've been missing is proof that the policies came from the top and were implemented consistently across different congregations and circuits. These letters and memos show a deliberate pattern of prioritizing institutional protection over child safety, and they provide the context we need to help juries understand why so many cases were mishandled. Detective Chen's investigation was part of a broader effort by law enforcement agencies and advocacy groups to hold religious organizations accountable for institutional failures to protect children. Similar investigations were underway involving Catholic dioceses, Baptist churches, and other religious groups that had used their spiritual authority to silence victims and protect perpetrators. The Jehovah's Witness cases were particularly challenging because the organization's closed nature and emphasis on avoiding secular authorities made it difficult for outsiders to understand internal processes and gather evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The legal implications of cooperating with Detective Chen's investigation were complex and potentially serious. The organization's legal department was known for pursuing aggressive defamation and harassment lawsuits against former members who spoke publicly about internal organizational matters. They had vast financial resources and a team of experienced attorneys who specialized in silencing critics through intimidation and litigation. Even if my testimony was protected under whistleblower statutes, the organization could still make my life extremely difficult through civil lawsuits, private investigators, and coordinated harassment campaigns designed to discredit my character and credibility. Yet as I weighed these risks against the potential benefits of speaking out, I kept returning to the fundamental moral question that had driven my father to preserve this documentation in the first place. How many more children would be harmed while good people remained silent about institutional policies that enabled and protected predators? How many more families would be destroyed by an organization that demanded absolute loyalty while betraying the most basic principles of justice and compassion? How many more victims would suffer in isolation, believing they were alone and powerless against a system designed to silence them? The turning point came when Amanda Morrison told me she had decided to pursue legal action against her grandfather's estate and the congregations that had failed to protect her, regardless of whether I provided supporting testimony. "I'm 47 years old," she said, "and I'm tired of carrying this burden alone. Even if I lose, even if they destroy my reputation and my credibility, at least I'll know I tried to hold them accountable. Maybe other victims will see that it's possible to fight back, and maybe that will give them the courage to tell their own stories." Amanda's courage, in the face of overwhelming institutional power, reminded me of the moral clarity that had driven my own father to finally break his silence, even if only on his deathbed. She had far more to lose than I did. Her case would require her to relive traumatic experiences in public, to face aggressive cross-examination designed to destroy her credibility, to endure character assassination and victim blaming from an organization with unlimited resources for litigation. Yet she was willing to take those risks because she understood that institutional change only happens when individuals find the courage to challenge powerful systems that seem unbeatable. That night, I called Detective Chen and told him I was ready to provide whatever assistance his investigation required. I also called Amanda and promised her that she would not face her legal battle alone. My father's documentation would support her case, and my testimony would corroborate her account of how the organization had failed to protect her when she was most vulnerable. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that the ground would somehow rise up to meet me. The day I decided to go public with my father's revelations was March 15th, 2019, exactly 36 years after the Society had issued that confidential memo about protecting the organization's reputation above all else. The symbolism was not lost on me as I sat in Detective Chen's office, formally agreeing to testify in multiple legal proceedings and provide sworn affidavits about the contents of my father's documentation. As I signed the paperwork that would transform me from a private citizen into a key witness in several high-profile cases, I thought about how my father would have felt, knowing that his courage, even if it came only at the end of his life, was finally bearing fruit in the pursuit of justice for victims he had failed to protect decades earlier. The first public revelation came through a carefully coordinated media strategy designed to maximize impact while minimizing the organization's ability to suppress the story through legal intimidation. Detective Chen had worked with investigative journalists from 3 major news outlets to ensure simultaneous coverage across television, print, and online platforms. The lead story aired on 60 Minutes on a Sunday evening in April, featuring interviews with Amanda Morrison and 4 other survivors whose cases were documented in my father's files. My own interview was conducted anonymously, with my voice disguised and my face obscured, but the documents I provided were authentic and verifiable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the broadcast, the organization's public relations department had issued a statement denying all allegations and characterizing the news reports as apostate-driven lies designed to damage the reputation of God's faithful organization. They claimed that the documents were forgeries, that the survivors were disgruntled former members seeking financial gain, and that the media coverage was part of a coordinated attack by Satan's system against true Christians. The statement concluded by reminding all Jehovah's Witnesses that they should avoid exposure to such poisonous propaganda and trust in the organization's spiritual guidance rather than secular media reports. Within my own extended family, the reaction was swift and devastating. My mother, who had been struggling to cope with widowhood while maintaining her faith in the organization that had defined her entire adult identity, was visited by 3 elders within 24 hours of the broadcast. They informed her that her son had become an apostate and that continued association with me would put her own spiritual standing at risk. She was advised to cut off all contact with me unless I repented publicly and withdrew my statements to the media. When she tried to defend me by explaining that I was only trying to help abuse victims, she was told that such reasoning showed she had been influenced by apostate thinking and needed immediate spiritual assistance. The phone call from my mother that evening was one of the most painful conversations of my life. Through tears, she explained that she could not continue our relationship unless I recanted my testimony and sought forgiveness from the organization for bringing reproach upon Jehovah's name. "David, I love you, but I love Jehovah more," she said, using language that had clearly been suggested by the elders who had visited her. "If you truly care about me and about your eternal salvation, you'll do the right thing and admit you were wrong." When I tried to explain that everything I had revealed was documented truth from my father's own files, she responded that Satan was capable of creating convincing lies and that only the organization could be trusted to interpret truth correctly. That conversation was our last meaningful contact. My mother died of pneumonia 14 months later, in May 2020, during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. I learned about her death through an obituary in the local newspaper rather than through family notification. The funeral was restricted to baptized Jehovah's Witnesses in good standing, and I was explicitly told not to attend. I stood in the cemetery parking lot during the burial service, watching from a distance as they lowered my mother into the ground next to my father. Knowing that the organization had succeeded in destroying our family relationship, just as it had destroyed so many others throughout the decades. The legal proceedings that followed my public testimony were complex, lengthy, and emotionally exhausting. Amanda Morrison's civil lawsuit against her grandfather's estate and the congregations that had failed to protect her became a landmark case that established important precedents for holding religious organizations accountable for institutional negligence in child protection. The trial lasted 3 weeks and featured testimony from multiple former elders, including myself, about the systematic policies that prioritized organizational reputation over child safety. The jury awarded Amanda substantial damages, but more importantly, the case generated extensive media coverage that educated the public about the hidden problems within religious institutions that claimed divine authority. Detective Chen's criminal investigation led to charges against 7 individuals who had escaped accountability for decades due to organizational cover-ups. 3 of these individuals were still alive and faced prosecution for crimes that had occurred as far back as the 1980s. Although statute of limitations issues prevented prosecution in some cases, the investigation uncovered evidence that led to charges in other jurisdictions where different legal standards applied. More significantly, the investigation prompted legislative changes in several states that extended statute of limitations periods for child sexual abuse cases and created new mandatory reporting requirements for religious leaders. The personal cost of my decision to speak out was severe, but not unexpected. I lost several long-time clients who were Jehovah's Witnesses, resulting in a significant reduction in my consulting income. My relationship with my mother was destroyed, and I was cut off from numerous relatives and family friends who remained active in the organization. Anonymous threatening letters began arriving at my home and office, warning me that I would face divine judgment for opposing God's chosen organization. My phone number and home address were circulated on social media platforms used by Jehovah's Witnesses, accompanied by warnings that I was a dangerous apostate who should be avoided at all costs. However, the positive responses far outweighed the negative consequences. Dozens of abuse survivors contacted me to share their own stories and express gratitude that someone with institutional knowledge was finally willing to validate their experiences publicly. Many of these individuals had suffered in isolation for years, believing they were alone in their struggles with religious trauma and institutional betrayal. Learning that their experiences were part of a documented pattern of organizational misconduct rather than isolated incidents helped them understand that their problems were not personal failures, but normal responses to abnormal treatment. Former elders and other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses began reaching out with additional documentation and testimony that supported and expanded upon the evidence my father had preserved. Brother Richard Hartwell, whose private letter expressing doubts about organizational policies had been included in my father's files, contacted me after seeing the news coverage. Now in his 80s, and no longer active in the organization, Brother Hartwell provided additional documentation about cases he had been involved in during his 40-year tenure as an elder. His testimony helped establish that the problems revealed in my father's documentation were not limited to our specific circuit, but reflected organization-wide policies and practices. The therapeutic value of speaking out became apparent as I connected with other survivors and advocates who were working to expose institutional abuse within religious organizations. For the first time in my adult life, I was able to process my own experiences growing up in a controlling religious environment without feeling isolated or abnormal. The support network that developed around these legal proceedings created lasting friendships and professional collaborations that have enriched my life in ways I never anticipated. Working alongside survivors, attorneys, investigators, and other advocates gave me a sense of purpose and meaning that had been missing since I left the organization as a young adult. Perhaps most importantly, my decision to honor my father's deathbed request had consequences that extended far beyond the specific cases we were able to pursue legally. The publicity generated by these revelations encouraged other news organizations to investigate similar problems within Jehovah's Witness congregations in different countries and regions. Documentary filmmakers began producing exposés that reached audiences who might never have learned about these issues through news reports alone. Academic researchers started studying the psychological and social dynamics of religious control and institutional abuse, creating scholarly literature that helped professionals understand how to treat religious trauma more effectively. The ripple effects continued to expand as survivors found courage to tell their own stories publicly, creating a growing chorus of voices that became increasingly difficult for the organization to dismiss or silence. Social media platforms provided forums where ex-Jehovah's Witnesses could connect with each other and share resources for recovery and healing. Support groups formed in cities around the world, offering face-to-face assistance for people leaving the organization or dealing with the aftermath of religious trauma. Therapeutic professionals began developing specialized treatment approaches for individuals recovering from high-control religious environments. Looking back now, 5 years after making the decision to speak out, I can see that my father's final act of courage created consequences that none of us could have anticipated at the time. The documentation he preserved and the testimony I provided became part of a much larger movement toward accountability and transparency within religious institutions that had operated behind veils of secrecy for generations. While the Jehovah's Witness organization continues to deny wrongdoing and resist meaningful reform, the public awareness generated by these revelations has made it much more difficult for them to suppress future allegations or intimidate victims into silence. The personal healing that has resulted from this journey has been profound and unexpected. For most of my adult life, I carried guilt and confusion about leaving the organization, wondering whether I had made a terrible mistake that would cost me eternal salvation. Speaking out about the institutional problems I witnessed forced me to confront these feelings directly and recognize that my adolescent questions and concerns had been entirely valid. The organization's response to my testimony, attempting to destroy my credibility and isolate me from family relationships, only confirmed that I had been right to trust my own conscience rather than submit to human authority claiming divine sanction. Today, I continue to support survivors and advocate for reforms that will protect children within religious communities. The foundation Amanda Morrison and I established provides resources for individuals leaving high-control religious groups and funds legal assistance for abuse survivors pursuing justice against institutional perpetrators. We work with legislators to strengthen mandatory reporting laws and eliminate religious exemptions that allow spiritual leaders to avoid their obligations to protect vulnerable individuals. Most importantly, we help survivors understand that their experiences are valid, their voices matter, and their courage in speaking out can prevent others from suffering the same harm. As I finish sharing this story with you, I want to speak directly to anyone who might be struggling with similar situations in their own religious communities or families. Your conscience is trustworthy, even when authority figures tell you to ignore it. Your questions are valid, even when leaders discourage you from asking them. Your safety and well-being matter more than any organization's reputation or claims of divine authority. If you have witnessed abuse or misconduct within religious institutions, there are people and resources available to help you navigate the difficult process of speaking out and seeking justice. I also want to acknowledge the complexity of these situations for individuals who find genuine spiritual meaning and community within religious organizations, even those with serious institutional problems. My story is not intended to discourage anyone's faith or spiritual seeking, but rather to encourage critical thinking about the difference between serving God and serving human institutions that claim to represent God. It is possible to maintain personal faith while questioning organizational authority, to love your spiritual community while refusing to enable institutional misconduct, and to honor your religious heritage while protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. The courage my father found on his deathbed came too late to help the victims he failed to protect during his decades as an elder. But it was not too late to contribute to a movement that continues to help others find healing and justice. If you have your own story of institutional abuse or religious trauma, please consider sharing it in the comments below or reaching out to advocacy organizations that can provide support and guidance. Every voice that joins this conversation makes it a little bit harder for abusive institutions to operate in darkness and a little bit easier for survivors to find the help they need. Thank you for listening to this difficult but necessary story. Your engagement, your comments, and your willingness to subscribe to this channel represent more than social media metrics. They represent a community of people who believe that truth matters, that children deserve protection, and that no human organization should be allowed to claim immunity from accountability simply because it operates under the banner of religion. Together, we can continue working toward a world where spiritual authority is used to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them, where religious communities foster healing rather than hide harm, and where speaking truth is celebrated rather than punished.